Hello and welcome. Tonight we drift into a story not of a single nation, but of how one nation's suffering reshaped the entire world. You've heard of battles of Gettysburg, of Antietam, of blood and thunder beneath torn flags. But tonight we step beyond the smoke, beyond the noise of cannons, to the quieter revolutions, the ones that began when the war ended. The Civil War was more than America fighting itself. It was the hinge on which the modern world would turn. A war that reached across oceans, altered empires, and redefined what freedom meant for every human being who dared to dream of it. So lie back and listen as the past breathes softly through time, as we wander through the echoes of a war that refused to stay within its own borders. This is how the American Civil War changed the world beyond the battlefields. The land remembers before history does. Before the first cannon roared, the Mississippi itself seemed to hold its breath. Its waters reflected a country divided, one half rooted in cotton and bondage, the other in factories and restless ambition. Under the same flag, two different Americas marched toward an inevitable fire. The fields of the South, lined with white blooms, hid the stories of millions who labored unseen. In the North, cities hummed the rhythm of a new age, of iron rails and steam. And yet beneath that progress, fear trembled. Fear that the old world of lords and laborers might die, or worse, that it might live forever. When the war came, it was not just armies that collided, but centuries of belief colliding to decide what kind of world would come next. The cannons thundered. The rivers filled with the silence of what could not be spoken. But somewhere in that chaos, something larger was awakening, an idea that would ripple far beyond the battlefields. Because the Civil War was not simply an American tragedy. It was the first great industrial war, and in its smoke, the future began to take shape. The machine had awakened. Steam hissed through the heart of a nation torn in two. Locomotives carried men faster than history could count them. Telegraph wires whispered across mountains and valleys, messages of life, of death, of orders from distant minds. The war became a network pulsing with electricity and invention. Factories turned from tools to rifles, from plows to cannon barrels. War had become a matter of production, and the world was watching. In London, in Paris, in St. Petersburg, the powerful took notes. For the first time, the power of a nation was not measured by the size of its land, but by the speed of its industry. The iron rails that once carried grain now carried armies. And the factories that once clothed children now clothed soldiers. From this, every future war would learn its rhythm. Every empire would seek its own machines, and humanity would never again fight as it once had. But the world was watching for another reason too. Across the Atlantic, the crowned heads of Europe leaned close to the fire. Could a republic survive a war within itself? Could democracy bleed and still breathe? In London, men whispered of intervention. Cotton, the lifeblood of their mills, lay trapped behind blockades. French diplomats dreamed of glory, of empire reborn on American soil. But as months turned to years, the question changed. If the Union could survive, what did that mean for the monarchies of Europe? The answer, though silent, was clear. If a nation of free men could fight, fracture, and still remain whole, then the age of kings was numbered. From the slums of Paris to the cafes of Vienna, revolutionaries studied Lincoln's words. In their hearts they saw a possibility, that liberty could endure its own chaos and rise from it stronger than before. And then came a turning point, not of bullets, but of ink. The Emancipation Proclamation, a piece of paper that changed the language of war itself. No longer a fight for union, but for the meaning of freedom. The moment Lincoln's hand moved across that parchment, the world tilted. In the Caribbean, freedmen gathered to read the words aloud. In Brazil, whispers of abolition grew louder. Even in the dark holds of ships that still trafficked souls, those words traveled invisible but unstoppable. The Civil War had declared something radical, that liberty was not a privilege of the few, but the birthright of all. And with that, America's war became humanity's war. The ideals of freedom, once confined to speeches, had stepped into the real world, carried on the wind, and forever changing it. But progress always walks beside pain. In the camps and hospitals of both North and South, a different kind of battle was being fought. Surgeons worked beneath flickering lamps, hands trembling over shattered limbs. Anesthetics hissed, blood soaked the earth, and a new kind of medicine was born. The Civil War became a laboratory of survival. The chaos of battle forced invention. Field hospitals, organized nursing, the first ambulance corps. Techniques that saved lives here would later save millions more. Every bandage tied, every life clung to in the mud of Antietam or Shiloh, was a quiet victory of science over despair. And beyond the hospital tents, another revolution: photography. The war became the first to be captured, frame by frame. For the first time, the dead looked back at the living. No painting could soften it, no poet could hide it. The lens told the truth, and the world could never look away again. As the smoke cleared, a new challenge began. The Union had survived, but what would be reborn in its place? In the ruins of Richmond and Atlanta, the seeds of the modern United States began to grow. Railroads stretched west, stitching together what war had torn apart. Banks were created, laws reimagined, industries reborn. The blueprint of the modern superpower was drawn in the ashes of rebellion. Other nations watched this reconstruction like prophecy. Germany, soon to unify, studied how to merge power and progress. Japan, newly awakened to the world, learned how industry could forge identity. Even empires long at their height began to sense their decline. Because the lesson of the Civil War was not just about freedom, it was about resilience, that a nation could fall to pieces and still find a way to rebuild itself stronger. The echoes reached further than borders. Prussian generals studied Gettysburg's maps. Russian reformers praised Lincoln's courage. Young revolutionaries in Italy spoke his name like scripture. And decades later, when the world plunged into another age of war, it was those same lessons of total mobilization, of moral cause, that guided them. The American Civil War became a mirror for every struggle after it, a warning and a guide, a testament that the cost of equality is endless, but the pursuit of it eternal. And yet, for all its vastness, the war remained deeply human. When the guns fell silent, a different silence took hold, the silence of mourning. Cemeteries bloomed like ghostly gardens. Stone markers gleamed under morning dew. Names carved into marble, a generation frozen in grief. But grief became remembrance. Pain became art. Painters, writers, and sculptors turned loss into meaning. Photographs of boys barely 20 became symbols of an entire era. The war taught humanity how to remember, not just its victories, but its sorrows. And in that remembrance, the seeds of peace quietly grew. Reconstruction followed, a promise wrapped in pain, a rebirth that stumbled under its own hope. The freedmen walked new roads, their chains replaced by fragile dreams of equality. The nation tried to rebuild itself politically, spiritually, morally. But wounds that deep do not close quickly. And yet within that slow healing, democracy learned endurance. The Constitution stretched to include those once excluded. The words "we the people" began slowly to mean something closer to all. And as America found its new footing, so too did the idea of democracy itself worldwide. The notion that a nation could survive civil war and still rise again became the beacon for every people yearning for self-rule. From Ireland to India, from South America to the Pacific, the experiment of the United States had proven one thing: freedom could survive its own fire. Time passed, and the cannons grew silent even in memory. But their echoes traveled far. Through the 20th century, through struggles for civil rights, through revolutions and reformations across continents. Everywhere men and women marched for freedom. Somewhere quietly, the spirit of that old war walked beside them. Lincoln's words found new voices. The courage of abolitionists found new causes. The moral heartbeat of the Civil War became universal, not an American story but a human one. Because beyond the battlefields, Beyond the monuments and marble, the war's truest victory was unseen. A world that learned, however slowly, that progress born of pain can still be progress. And tonight, as the world turns quietly beneath your window, that story still hums soft as the river's song. The Mississippi flows on, older now, but still whispering the same truths. That a nation divided once taught the world how to mend. That mercy and might can share the same banner. That from the darkest conflict, light can emerge that touches every shore. The American Civil War ended more than a century and a half ago, but its echoes still walk among us, in every act of resistance, in every call for freedom, and in every attempt to heal what is broken. So as you drift into sleep tonight, know this: the story of that war is not one of death, but of transformation, of a world that burned and then began anew. And somewhere, beyond the battlefields, the dream of a freer, fairer world still carries on the wind. The smoke of battle had barely lifted when something new began to stir. Not in the fields or the forests, but in the hearts of cities, where furnaces roared like awakening beasts, and the air shimmered with the birth of iron. Steam hissed, rails gleamed in the morning sun, and the sound of industry became the new drumbeat of war. From the forges of Pittsburgh to the shipyards of Maine, men toiled through the night, faces glowing in furnace light. The clang of hammers replaced the sound of larks. Every spark that leapt from molten metal seemed to signal a new age rising. The Civil War had begun as a clash of ideals, but it would become the world's first great experiment in mechanized struggle. A revolution not just of soldiers, but of systems, of gears and steel, of wires and wheels, of thought turned into motion. The old world of horse and musket was giving way. Here began the marriage of man and machine. Telegraph wires stretched across the land like veins of lightning. From city to camp, from White House to battlefield, messages flew faster than any messenger on horseback could ride. Generals no longer waited for days to know their fate. News now traveled at the speed of thought. And for the first time in human history, time itself could be coordinated across hundreds of miles. A commander's words could leap mountains. A soldier's cry for help could echo back through copper and spark. The telegraph changed everything. It made the vastness of the continent feel smaller and made war feel terrifyingly efficient. Every order, every movement, reduced to dots and dashes, a code for life and death. The machine had learned to speak. Then came the rails. Lines of iron cutting through wilderness and wheat fields alike. What had once taken weeks by wagon now took days by train. The locomotive became the new war horse, breathing smoke, shrieking like a living thing. They called them iron steeds. And when they thundered across bridges of their own making, the ground itself trembled in awe. Armies could now move with unnatural speed. Tens of thousands of men, tons of supplies, and cannon, food, ammunition all rolled forward on wheels that never tired. The North's network of railways became its secret weapon, a web of motion connecting foundry to front line. Each train that departed carried not only steel and men, but destiny. The South, proud but less industrial, watched the iron arteries of its enemy pump strength into every battle. The Confederacy had courage, yes, but the Union had machinery, and machinery never slept. Factories became fortresses. Foundries became the heartbeats of entire cities. Women and children worked alongside men, their hands guiding the gears of a world at war. The clatter of sewing machines stitched uniforms by the millions. The smoke of ironworks darkened the horizon for miles. Coal, black as night, became more precious than gold. The machine was no longer a servant. It was a commander, and humanity obeyed its rhythm. In the North, industrial power reached a fever pitch, so great that even foreign nations paused to wonder, was this what the future looked like? Armies fed not by courage alone, but by the endless appetite of the machine. Across the Atlantic, Britain and France took note. The world's old empires had fought wars of muskets and honor. But America was showing them something new, a war of engines, a war of production, a war that would echo through every century to come. Even at sea, the old order was dying. The wooden hulls of the past could not withstand the new iron giants. When the USS Monitor faced the CSS Virginia in 1862, the world watched breathlessly. Iron met iron. Cannonballs bounced harmlessly from steel armor. The age of the wooden navy ended in a single afternoon. Smoke rose from the bay, and in that haze the future of naval warfare took shape, steam-powered, iron-sided, relentless. The world's admirals wrote frantic letters that night. In shipyards from London to Tokyo, blueprints were redrawn. The oceans would never look the same again. The Civil War had not only transformed a nation, it had rewritten the rules of global warfare. Yet in this awakening of industry, something human was quietly fading. The blacksmith who once forged a sword for a single soldier now stood beside machines that could birth hundreds in a day. The craftsman's touch was replaced by the precision of gears. The intimacy of creation gave way to the anonymity of mass production. But in this loss came an odd kind of equality. The war no longer depended on the strength of one man's arm, but on the rhythm of many working together. It became, in its terrible way, democratic. Everyone had a part to play, from the man who mined the coal, to the woman who rolled the bandages, to the child who delivered telegrams through the rain and mud. The Civil War had turned a divided nation into an enormous beating machine, and that machine was learning to work as one. The changes reached deeper than war itself. The telegraph would outlive the cannon. The locomotive would outlast the regiment. The systems created to fight the enemy would soon bind a peacetime country together. When the last shot was fired, the rails did not stop. They pushed westward, stretching toward the Pacific like fingers of progress. Towns grew where tracks met. Markets thrived where telegraph poles stood. Factories turned from guns to plows, and America began to dream in iron and steam. The war had forced invention, but invention refused to stop once the war was done. Far away, other nations watched in fascination. Prussia studied the telegraph system, noting how quickly armies could coordinate. Russia examined the logistics that kept the Union supplied. Japan sent students to learn industrial techniques, preparing for its own transformation decades later. The ripples spread quietly, but they spread everywhere. In Europe, generals realized that future wars would not be won by bravery alone. They would be won by supply lines, by speed, by the ability to replace what was lost faster than the enemy could. The Civil War had taught the world that modernity itself was a weapon. Within the laboratories of military surgeons, a different kind of machine hummed. Microscopes, scalpels, sterilization equipment, the beginnings of scientific medicine. The same industrial mindset that built railways began to rebuild the human body. In the dim light of field hospitals, innovation was forced upon necessity. Doctors learned to amputate quickly, cleanly. They learned to use anesthesia with precision. They learned, above all, to organize to treat medicine as another system of logistics. And from that, modern healthcare would be born. Every new syringe, every ambulance, every organized medical corps of the future owed something to this moment, when war met science beneath the canvas of a tent. The machine also changed how people saw. Matthew Brady and his photographers carried bulky cameras onto the battlefields. Each click of the shutter captured the unvarnished truth rows of fallen men, towns reduced to dust, faces staring at eternity through glass plates. For the first time, war could not hide behind glory. It was there, in silver nitrate and shadow, etched forever. The world looked at those images and gasped, because in every photograph, they saw the face of progress, brilliant, unstoppable, and merciless. The machine could reveal truth as easily as it could create death. And in that truth lay both horror and awakening. Back home, inventors felt the fever too. A young engineer named Edison tinkered by lamplight. A generation of dreamers began to see machines, not as tools of destruction, but as instruments of wonder. The war had shown them what power looked like, the ability to command distance, to mold metal, to harness fire, and in peace, they would turn that power toward creation. The sewing machine, the typewriter, and the telephone, all children of that same industrial spirit that the Civil War had set in motion. The line between weapon and invention blurred, but the momentum was unstoppable. The machine had tasted purpose, and it would never sleep again. In the quiet after battle, the fields still bore the scars of both man and engine. Rails twisted from explosions, locomotives lying like broken beasts in the mud. But even in ruin, there was a strange beauty proof that the nation had crossed a threshold it could never uncross. The old pastoral world of carriages and candles, of slow letters and small maps was gone. In its place stood something louder, faster, brighter. The hum of factories, the rattle of trains, the spark of electricity leaping across the night. The machine had awakened, and the world would never sleep the same again. Yet not all progress is gentle. For every mile of track laid, forests fell. For every ton of steel forged, rivers ran black. The land paid its own quiet price. But history rarely asks permission. It only moves forward, iron-willed and inexorable. And so the United States moved with it, a nation reborn in soot and steam, its destiny no longer measured by acres of farmland, but by miles of track, by tons of coal, by the brilliance of sparks flying in the dark. When the war finally ended, the soldiers returned home to a world they barely recognized. The farms they had left were now near factories. The towns they remembered now buzzed with locomotives. The rhythm of life itself had changed tempo. They had fought for union, for freedom, for cause, but they returned to find they had also fought for something else. The beginning of modern time. The machine had not just awakened. It had rewritten what it meant to be human, to live by the clock, to move by the schedule, to depend on the hum of distant engines, more than on the turning of the seasons. The Civil War had set the gears of modern life in motion, and those gears still turn today. From Pittsburgh's forges to Maine's shipyards, from the humming telegraphs to the thunder of trains, from the ironclads that ruled the sea to the factories that shaped the sky, this was the true revolution. The marriage of man and machine, a union of muscle and metal that began in fire and ended in transformation. The Civil War was the crucible, and from its smoke rose the future. Steam still whispers that story. Rails still gleam beneath the sun. And somewhere, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint rhythmic clatter, the heartbeat of the machine that changed the world. Across the Atlantic, the winds carried whispers of war. Not just the sound of gunfire echoing across American valleys, but the uneasy rustle of papers in foreign capitals, and the murmured questions of men who ruled half the world. What was happening across that ocean? Could a republic, an experiment barely 80 years old, survive a war within itself? Could freedom fight against freedom and still remain whole? In the smoky coffeehouses of London, men leaned across newspapers, by their teacups trembling as they read of Shiloh, of Antietam, of Gettysburg. Will democracy devour itself? They asked. Will the republic split apart and prove the monarchs right after all? And in those questions lay something deeper, a tremor of fear. Because if the Union survived, it would mean that the age of kings was ending, not by sword, but by the steady will of a people who refused to bow. In the gilded salons of Paris, the conversation swirled like perfume and smoke. Ladies in silks spoke of liberty as if it were fashion. Writers and philosophers debated slavery and destiny beneath crystal chandeliers. To some, the American conflict was a tragedy. To others, it was prophecy. Napoleon III, seated beneath his empire's eagles, watched the war with both curiosity and calculation. France dreamed of influence in Mexico, of reviving the glory of old empires while the New World bled. If America fell apart, perhaps France could rise again across the ocean. But even in the emperor's court, the whispers grew dangerous. For beneath every golden surface, the shadow of 1789 still lingered. The people remembered what it meant to rise up against kings, and the sight of a nation fighting for freedom's definition stirred something deep in the French heart. The American Civil War, in all its distant fury, had become a mirror, and Europe saw itself reflected there, fractured and restless. In London, the mood was sharper, colder. The British Empire, proud and global, was bound to America not by friendship, but by cotton. The South's plantations fed Britain's mills, and the mills fed the empire's wealth. But as the Union blockaded southern ports, the looms of Manchester fell silent. Tens of thousands lost their work. Famine threatened Lancashire's workers, men and women who had never seen a slave, but whose hunger was tied to the whip that cracked in distant fields. It would have been easy for Britain to side with the South, to claim it was merely protecting trade. The Confederacy sent diplomats, promising gold, cotton, and gratitude. British newspapers printed sympathy for the Southern cause. Aristocrats admired the Confederacy's manners, its echo of an older, gentlemanly world. But in the dark, among the workers, another conscience stirred. At public halls in Manchester, thousands gathered, poor and hungry, yet holding candles against the cold. They wrote letters to Abraham Lincoln, letters of solidarity from the heart of industrial Britain, saying that though they starved, they would not support slavery. Lincoln read those words and wept, and across the ocean he sent his gratitude. It was one of the rare moments in history when the powerless spoke louder than kings. The world was learning that morality, too, could be a force of diplomacy. In Russia, the Tsar watched in silence. Alexander II, reformer and ruler of vast frozen lands, had just freed millions of serfs. He saw in Lincoln's struggle a reflection of his own. Both leaders stood at crossroads between old bondage and new freedom. Both faced resistance from those who profited from chains. The Russian Empire, long distant from the American experiment, found itself oddly as its quiet ally. Russian ships visited American harbors, a gesture subtle but unmistakable, a signal that the Tsar's sympathies leaned toward the Union. In Europe's royal courts, eyebrows rose. Why would an emperor support a republic? But Alexander understood something they did not. If freedom could survive in America, perhaps it could also endure in Russia. And beneath the splendor of palaces, beneath the frost and marble, the idea of progress glowed faintly, like embers refusing to die. The world of the 1860s was watching with fascination, but also with fear. For centuries, the balance of power had been clear. Kings ruled, armies obeyed, and the people endured. But across the Atlantic, the people were writing their own laws, fighting their own battles, and defining freedom on their own terms. To Europe's monarchs, it was chaos. To its thinkers, it was destiny. Karl Marx, writing from London, studied the Civil War not as a tragedy, but as a struggle between the past and the future. He saw the South as a feudal relic, the North as a herald of industrial progress. He wrote that the war was not only about slavery, but about the direction of civilization itself. And though few in America read his words then, his observation echoed through time. That history was not made by emperors or kings, but by the movements of ordinary people, driven by hunger, belief, and hope. Across Europe, the tension between power and principle deepened. Every headline from America became a parable. Was liberty worth the blood it cost? Could equality survive ambition? Could any nation born in revolution endure the weight of its own ideals? These were not just American questions. They were human ones. In Vienna, the old Habsburg court dismissed it all as folly. A government of the people? Impossible. The empire had survived centuries by crushing such dreams. But even there, younger voices whispered otherwise. Students and soldiers traded smuggled pamphlets about Lincoln, about freedom, about the strange idea that men could govern themselves without a crown above them. For them, the Civil War was not a foreign conflict. It was a forecast of what the next century would demand. While Europe debated, its empires gambled. Ships from Britain and France hovered near the American coast, searching for excuses to intervene. The South courted recognition desperately, believing foreign aid could tip the balance. But every cannon fired at Fort Sumter, every letter from Lincoln, every word of emancipation changed the game. Once slavery became the war's moral center, No empire could touch it without hypocrisy. Britain, having outlawed slavery decades earlier, could not now fight to defend it abroad. France, which still claimed liberty, equality, fraternity, could not openly side with bondage. Diplomats shifted uncomfortably. The old world's politics collided with a new world's conscience. The Union, by standing firm, had turned the struggle into something larger than itself, not merely a civil war, but a reckoning for the soul of the modern world. And so the world watched. As the battles raged from Bull Run to Chattanooga, as cities burned and flags fell, the eyes of monarchs, ministers, and common men remained fixed on America. Some watched with hope, some with dread, but none with indifference. If the Union failed, the monarchs could breathe easy. Democracy would have proven itself fragile, unfit to rule the turbulent hearts of men. But if the Union endured, if freedom triumphed even at the cost of millions of lives, then the future would belong to the people, not to the thrones. In London's parlours they argued about it still. The clink of glasses, the rustle of broadsheets, and in every voice a mixture of fascination and disbelief. The Americans, they said, were tearing themselves apart. And yet beneath the carnage, they saw something that unnerved them: resolve, faith, the conviction that ideals were worth fighting for, even when the fighting itself seemed endless. It was a kind of courage that empires, for all their grandeur, had long since forgotten. Meanwhile, on the streets of Europe's great cities, artists and writers found inspiration in the transatlantic storm. Painters imagined Lincoln as a modern Moses, leading his people through fire to freedom. Poets turned the war into allegory, the human soul struggling to free itself from its own chains. In music halls, songs were sung about the land of the free. Even those who mocked America's violence could not ignore the strange magnetism of its ideals. The idea that a nation of common men could endure its own contradictions and rise renewed, it haunted Europe's imagination. For those bound under monarchies, America became more than a country. It became a symbol, a dangerous one. When the smoke of Gettysburg drifted across the Atlantic, it carried with it not just the scent of gunpowder, but a question whispered in every palace and parliament: if they can fight for equality, what are we waiting for? And in that whisper, revolutions began to dream again. Years would pass before the world realized how deeply the Civil War had changed its course. But even as the guns fell silent, the echoes continued to shape diplomacy, philosophy, and empire. In Britain, debates over workers' rights grew louder. In France, new republics would rise and fall, each one invoking the same spirit of liberty. In Russia, reform continued slow, uneven, but inevitable. And across the globe, every nation wrestling with its own divisions would look back on the American Civil War and find a reflection of itself. Because the war was not simply about North and South, Union or Confederacy. It was about whether an idea, the idea of government by the people, could survive the weight of its own imperfections. The empires watched. They waited for the republic to crumble, but it did not. Instead, it stumbled forward, wounded but unbroken, and in doing so, it redefined power itself. No longer would legitimacy be measured only by crowns or armies, but by endurance, by a nation's ability to fall and rise again, to be fractured and yet remain whole. In time, those same empires would crumble. Their flags would fade. Their palaces would become museums. But the experiment they once mocked would endure. The United States would become not just a country, but a concept, proof that freedom, though fragile, could survive even its own fire. And somewhere in the echo of that truth, the world began to change. The monarchs who had once watched from afar had witnessed the future being born, not in their courts, but across the ocean, in a republic that refused to die. The newspapers in London would one day stop printing war reports. The cafes of Paris would move on to new debates. But the memory lingered. That for 4 long years, the world had watched a nation redefine what it meant to be free. And though the old empires did not know it then, they had already begun their slow descent, their thrones trembling at the thought that power could belong not to bloodlines, but to belief. Because the Civil War had not only changed America, it had changed the very imagination of humanity. And across oceans, in the quiet of royal chambers and the noise of city streets, the old world peered into the mirror of the new and saw its own reflection, fading. The year is 1863. The world stands on the edge of a sentence, waiting for a single word. And that word is freedom. It moves not as a shout, but as a whisper, a trembling breath carried through candlelit rooms, across ocean winds, through the hearts of men and women who have never dared to believe it could reach them. The cannons still roar, the fields still burn, and yet somewhere between ink and intent, history begins to turn. In the White House, the lamps burn late. Abraham Lincoln, weary and hollow-eyed, sits before a blank sheet of parchment. His hand trembles not from doubt, but from the weight of knowing that what he writes tonight will change not only a nation, but the very meaning of justice itself. Outside, the snow falls over Washington, silent, indifferent, pure. Inside, he dips his pen, and the Emancipation Proclamation is born. Not a perfect decree, not a cure for centuries of suffering, but a spark, and sparks, once born, have a way of setting the world alight. When the news spreads, the reactions ripple like an earthquake beneath the skin of the world. In the streets of New York, bells ring and prayers rise. In the cotton fields of Mississippi, men and women stop, unsure if they have heard correctly. Freedom? Could it be real? They look toward the horizon as if expecting the sky itself to split open and deliver them. But what arrives instead is the slow, relentless march of an idea that refuses to die. The proclamation does not instantly end slavery. It cannot. But it declares in the language of nations that bondage has lost its legitimacy, that the world must choose a side. And across the Atlantic, the sound of chains cracking echoes in hearts long accustomed to silence. In the Caribbean, the wind shifts. Haiti, the first nation born from slave rebellion, listens with knowing pride. They have walked this path before, through blood, fire, and impossible hope. In the markets of Kingston and Port of Spain, sailors whisper of the great proclamation, of a president who dared to speak of freedom while the guns still thundered. It feels like prophecy. And in Brazil, where slavery still stands as law, the words drift like a forbidden song. Plantation owners scoff, but the enslaved listen. They pass the rumor from mouth to mouth, a candle flame hidden beneath cupped hands. If it can happen there, they think, perhaps one day it can happen here. Even in Africa, still carved and claimed by foreign empires, something changes, something almost imperceptible. The moral compass of the world begins to tilt. The traders who once trafficked in human lives now speak of reform. Colonial governors, their ledgers heavy with hypocrisy, feel the faint tremor of a shifting tide. No law in Washington can unmake centuries of greed. But the idea escapes its American cradle and drifts into the conscience of the world. In London, the great abolitionists, men like John Bright and Thomas Hughes, stand in Parliament and declare that history has chosen its moment. They see Lincoln not as a distant politician, but as a moral giant, a man willing to tether his nation's fate to a single word: liberty. In drawing rooms, the aristocracy murmurs uneasily. Freedom, once an American curiosity, is becoming a global contagion. Even the mighty British Empire, which has built its wealth on colonies and control, senses that the old order cannot last forever. The Emancipation Proclamation reaches beyond politics. It becomes a revelation. Priests preach it from pulpits. Poets rap it in verse. Children repeat it without understanding, but their voices carry it into the future. The world begins to measure itself against a new standard, not of power, but of principle. The American Civil War, once dismissed as a quarrel between brothers, has become something else. A revolution in the world's moral imagination. On the battlefields, the proclamation breathes new life into the Union ranks. For many, the war had been about union, territory, or loyalty. Now it becomes about something holier. The fight for freedom gives purpose to sacrifice. Black men, once forbidden to bear arms, now march beneath the same flag that once excluded them. The 54th Massachusetts, proud and defiant, becomes the living embodiment of the promise. They fight not for land, but for recognition, for the right to belong to the world as free men. And their courage spreads faster than any proclamation could. Their valor becomes legend, and legend becomes proof. When they charge the ramparts of Fort Wagner, bullets cannot silence the truth they carry. That freedom, once given form, cannot be undone. For Lincoln, the war is no longer just about victory. It is about redemption, for his nation and perhaps for humanity itself. He understands now that the Union's survival means little if it does not stand for something greater than itself. In letters to friends, he writes of a new birth of freedom, as though he senses that his country is being reborn through fire. And in his quiet moments, he wonders if he was chosen for this, to be the man who turns suffering into salvation. History will make him a martyr. But in life, he is simply a weary man trying to hold a fractured world together with faith and ink. The proclamation also forces the world's empires to look inward. In France, intellectuals debate its meaning with feverish intensity. Victor Hugo writes that it is a trumpet blast across the centuries. In Britain, newspapers that once doubted Lincoln's resolve now hail him as a visionary. But not all are pleased. In the cotton fields of India, the British East India Company calculates the cost of moral virtue. The blockade of the American South has strangled the cotton trade. Factories in Manchester lie silent. And yet, when the people of Britain declare that liberty matters more than profit, the empire must listen. The cry of emancipation echoes through its colonies. Not loudly, not yet, but it is there, a low rumble beneath the surface of order. In Havana, in Rio, in the markets of West Africa, the old trade falters. The last ships carrying human cargo grow cautious, sailing under false flags, their captains glancing nervously at the horizon. The world's conscience has turned against them. And though greed is patient, it can no longer move so freely. The age of chains is dying, and with it the age of empires built upon them. Yet even as freedom spreads like dawn, darkness resists. In the South, plantation owners cling to a dying dream. They burn their own fields rather than let free men work them. They whisper of vengeance, of lost honor, of a world turned upside down. But they cannot stop the tide. For every chain broken, another heart is opened. For every field abandoned, a new life begins elsewhere. Freedom is not a gift handed down. It is a storm that no man can command. Across oceans, artists and writers struggle to capture what is happening. Painters depict the broken shackles, the rising sun, the kneeling figures rising to their feet. But no canvas can contain the vastness of it, how an idea born in pain can move continents. In Italy, Garibaldi praises the North's fight as the continuation of human liberty. In Russia, serfs recently freed from bondage hear of the proclamation and smile, as if recognizing distant kinship. In Africa, the story arrives with missionaries and traders, a strange tale of white men fighting to free black men. Confusing, contradictory, yet somehow magnificent. Because even when imperfect, progress carries its own kind of beauty. The Emancipation Proclamation is not an end. It is a beginning, a promise that must still be earned. Its power lies not in the paper it was written on, but in the minds it awakens. Generations will come to see it not as a law, but as a turning point in the human story, the moment when the struggle for freedom became a global inheritance. And though the fighting continues, though Gettysburg still waits, and Richmond still burns, something has already shifted in the soul of mankind. The world's heart, once divided between those who rule and those who obey, now begins to beat to a different rhythm. Empires sense it. Economies feel it. Philosophers write of it. The idea that all men are created equal is no longer a sentence confined to parchment. It is a storm cloud rolling across the earth. In the ports of Africa, in the sugar fields of the Caribbean, in the silver mines of South America, the whispers grow louder. Freedom is coming, not today, not tomorrow, but someday, because it has already begun elsewhere. The moral gravity of the world has shifted. It will take decades for the change to reach every shore. but it will not stop. The Emancipation Proclamation has made slavery not just illegal, but unthinkable. And once an idea becomes unthinkable, it is already undone. In his final days, Lincoln reflects on what the war has truly cost. He walks the corridors of the White House at night, haunted by the ghosts of both friend and foe. He knows the work is not finished. Freedom is fragile. Peace will demand more courage than war ever did. But he also knows that the world has changed forever. He can feel it in the letters he receives from abroad, from Britain's workers, from France's poets, from Russia's reformers. They thank him not for victory, but for vision. And he realizes something profound, that one nation's moral awakening can become the conscience of the world. When the cannons fall silent, the idea remains. It travels on steamships and in newspapers, in sermons and songs. It crosses deserts and mountains and carried by dreamers and rebels alike. It will inspire uprisings in Cuba, abolition in Brazil, reform in Africa and Asia. It will echo in the hearts of those yet unborn, who dare to believe that justice is worth the struggle. Because the Emancipation Proclamation did not only free a people, it freed a principle that no human being can own another, that liberty is not a privilege, but a birthright. And though its author would fall to an assassin's bullet, his words would not die. They would travel farther than any army, stronger than any empire, until even the most distant corners of the earth could feel the warmth of their fire. The chains have broken, the world has turned, and though the path ahead remains long, the direction is set. Freedom, once confined to parchment, now walks the earth. It limps, it stumbles, it bleeds, but it moves forward, and it does not stop. Because once an idea begins to live, no power on earth can unmake it. And somewhere far across oceans, in the hearts of the forgotten, in the dreams of the enslaved, and in the silence after the guns, the world exhales and begins again. War has always been a maker of monsters, but in the 1860s it became something else, a maker of miracles. Not the kind born from faith or prophecy, but from desperation, from hands too weary to tremble, and minds too stubborn to surrender. The American Civil War was fought not only with courage and conviction, but with invention. It was the moment when iron met flesh, and necessity became the mother of science. No longer muskets and bayonets, but rifles that reached farther than sight could see. No longer letters carried on horseback, but telegraphs that spoke in lightning. No longer armies crawling through mud, but railways delivering war with mechanical precision. The world was learning to kill faster. But in the spaces between the gunfire, it was also learning how to save. At dawn, the field hospitals began to stir. Not hospitals as we would know them, but tents, barns, and broken churches, their floors slick with blood and hope. The air hung heavy with the scent of chloroform, sweat, and iron. A surgeon's saw glimmered in the dim light, its teeth wet with the price of progress. Outside, the cries of the wounded rose like hymns without words. Before the war, doctors had been craftsmen of small towns, trained more by apprenticeship than by science. They treated coughs, pulled teeth, delivered babies. They had never seen a battlefield, never held a man's life between two heartbeats. But war does not wait for learning. It demands it. And so they learned, on the job, in the mud beneath cannon fire. Every amputation, every fever, every failure became a lesson written in flesh. Anesthetics, once a curiosity of science, now became salvation. Ether and chloroform poured drop by drop onto cloth, turned agony into silence. It was imperfect, dangerous, but it was mercy. For the first time in human history, a man could lose a limb and not lose his mind. A soldier could fall asleep in pain and wake to possibility. The surgeons who wielded saw and scalpel were no longer butchers. They were pioneers, building medicine on the edge of hell. Triage, a word born from the chaos of war, emerged from necessity. Before the Civil War, every wounded man was treated in the order he arrived. But on battlefields where thousands fell in a single hour, order became impossible. Doctors learned to choose, to see who could be saved, who could wait and who could not. It was a cruel arithmetic, but it saved lives. And from it grew the modern system of emergency care, the quiet logic that still governs hospitals today. Behind the chaos of battle, an invisible war was being fought, against infection, against ignorance, against time itself. Antietam, Shiloh, Gettysburg, their names are carved into stone, but also into the annals of science. At Antietam, surgeons learned that cleanliness mattered, that instruments washed between operations could mean the difference between life and death. They did not yet know the word bacteria, but they knew that filth was the unseen enemy. At Shiloh, doctors saw the strange glow of soldiers' wounds, a phenomenon they would call angel's glow. Only decades later would science discover the truth, that bioluminescent bacteria, thriving in cold, damp soil, had cleansed the wounds of those who lay in the mud for days. What they called a miracle was the first whisper of microbiology. And at Gettysburg, amid 50,000 dead and wounded, the foundations of organized medical logistics were laid. Ambulance corps, supply lines for bandages and quinine, field reports cataloging diseases, systems born of necessity that would one day serve peace. The war was turning pain into process. The telegraph tapped through the night, its electric pulse the heartbeat of the Union. For the first time, commanders could communicate across vast distances. Orders flew faster than cavalry could ride. The front was no longer a line, it was a web. And that web would one day become the nervous system of a modern world. The railways, too, were no longer mere commerce. They became arteries of war, moving men, guns, and medicine with mechanical rhythm. The same engines that once carried grain now carried the wounded. Cars became mobile wards, rails became veins pulsing with the lifeblood of armies. The Civil War taught humanity something both simple and profound, that technology is neither good nor evil. It is what hands and hearts make of it. On the surgeon's table, a man from Ohio lies still. He has lost a leg, perhaps more. He will live, but he will not walk the same path again. Yet his survival is a victory, his wound a lesson. Thousands like him returned home scarred but alive, bearing the living proof that war could teach mercy as well as death. Artificial limbs were fashioned in workshops from Philadelphia to New York, crude at first, then refined. The science of prosthetics began not in comfort, but in compassion born of necessity. Each wooden leg, each metal joint, was a promise that loss could be endured and life remade. In the dark rooms of army hospitals, nurses worked beside doctors, their hands steady, their patience endless. They were not yet called professionals. They were called angels. Clara Barton, Dorothea Dix, Mary Ann Bickerdike, names history would later remember, but men on the battlefield simply called them salvation. They washed wounds, wrote letters, held hands as breaths grew shallow. They built the foundation of nursing as a science and gave compassion a new uniform. After the war, Barton would carry that spirit beyond the battlefield, founding the American Red Cross. Because some lessons learned in war belong to all humanity. The war changed medicine, but medicine also changed the war. Every stretcher carried not just a body, but a story, each soldier's survival proof of the progress being made. The Union's medical department, once chaotic, became a model of efficiency. Standardized reports, centralized supply chains, the first statistical studies of disease and surgery outcomes, all were born in these desperate years. From them would emerge the early roots of epidemiology, the idea that health could be measured, predicted, and improved. It was the birth of modern public health, conceived amid the ruins of war. In makeshift laboratories, doctors began to collect samples, to sketch diagrams, to wonder why certain wounds healed and others rotted. They were not yet scientists in the modern sense, but they were becoming them. Joseph Lister's theories of antisepsis, Louis Pasteur's experiments with germs, these discoveries would reach America soon after. And when they did, the men who had lived through the Civil War understood them instantly. They had seen infection. They had fought it blindly. Now, they had names for their enemy. Thus, The blood-soaked lessons of Gettysburg and Antietam would become the foundation stones of sterile surgery, of hospital sanitation, of medical science itself. War had turned experience into evidence, and evidence into knowledge. The Civil War's technological hunger also bred innovation elsewhere. The submarine, the repeating rifle, the ironclad ship, each invention a glimpse of the future. But beneath the noise of progress, a quieter revolution was taking place in the minds of those who sought to heal, not to destroy. The same spirit that drove men to invent new weapons drove others to find new ways to preserve life. Each battlefield discovery became a seed. Each surgeon's note, a foundation for the generations to come. From the ashes of destruction, medicine began to rise, not as an art, but as a science. Even the dead became teachers. In field morgues and medical tents, doctors performed autopsies not for crime, but for curiosity, to understand the human body, to learn how bullets traveled, how infection spread, how life faltered. It was grim work, but it was honest. And from those silent lessons grew the first atlases of anatomy based on real observation. What had once been horror became instruction. After the war, the veterans returned home, bringing with them scars, stumps, and steel in their bones. But they also brought stories of surgeons who worked for days without rest, of nurses who walked through fields of death to bring water, of strangers who refused to let suffering go unanswered. Their memories became medicine's mythology, and from that mythology, civilization would draw its future healers. Universities expanded their medical programs. Hospitals, once charitable refuges for the poor, became centers of learning. The lessons of war became the curriculum of peace. The surgeons of Antietam and Gettysburg became the professors of Harvard and Johns Hopkins. Their rough hands shaped the hands that would perform the first heart surgeries, the first transplants, the first miracles of modern life. War's cruelty had birthed the science that saves lives. Even the telegraph, born of war's necessity, became a tool of mercy. When epidemics struck, messages flew faster than ever before. Quarantine orders, supply lists, pleas for doctors, all carried on invisible wires. The same invention that had once directed armies now directed aid. And in that transformation lay the quiet redemption of progress. In time, the world would forget the names of most of those who bled, but not what their suffering achieved. Every antiseptic bottle, every clean bandage, every steady breath under anesthesia is an echo of those fields. The groans of the wounded became data. The chaos of war became order, and the compassion of a few became the salvation of millions. When people later said the Civil War changed the world, they spoke of politics, of freedom, of nations reborn. But beneath those grand themes lay something smaller, more intimate, the healing of the human body. For the first time in history, war had forced humanity to study itself, to measure its limits, to learn its fragility, to cherish its endurance. The men who once cut by candlelight, without knowing what infection meant, became the architects of hospitals, the founders of medical schools, the mentors of a modern age. Their tools were crude, their world was brutal, but their discoveries endure, because compassion, once awakened, is as unstoppable as any army. And so, in the quiet after the guns, the field hospitals were dismantled, the tents folded away, the instruments packed into wooden cases. But their legacy remained, in every heartbeat saved, in every life prolonged. The science of war had become the science of healing. The same iron that forged bullets would now forge scalpels. The same knowledge that learned to kill efficiently would learn to cure beautifully. War's darkest lessons had become civilization's brightest light. The world would go on to fight other wars, to build greater machines, to reach higher peaks of destruction and discovery. But each time, in every new field hospital, in every surgeon's calm beneath pressure, in every clean wound and saved life, the spirit of 1863 remained. That pain can teach compassion, and necessity can teach mercy. Because in the heart of all conflict lies the same unyielding truth, that even in our darkest hours, humanity looks for ways to heal. And in that search, we find our greatness. The guns have fallen silent. The smoke that once veiled the land begins to drift away, and in its place the faint hum of rebuilding. The soldiers return home. Their uniforms are tattered, their hearts heavier than their steps. But behind their eyes burns something fierce, the will to begin again. The fields they once fought across now lie scarred, craters filled with rainwater and silence. Rail lines twist like broken veins across the continent, cities smolder and farms stand empty. The nation is wounded, but not defeated. Out of this devastation, a new America will be born, one built not just from soil, but from steel, systems, and ideas. The war that destroyed slavery will also create a new kind of order, a template for the modern world. Before the Civil War, the United States had been a country of fragments, local banks, small farms, private roads, a patchwork stitched loosely by geography and hope. But 4 years of war had forced the government to think like an organism, to control, to coordinate, to survive. In those crucibles of necessity, the Union discovered something powerful. That strength could come from structure. That a nation, if organized, could endure anything. When the cannons ceased, that discovery did not vanish. It became policy. It became blueprint. Reconstruction. The word sounds like repair, but in truth, it meant recreation. The America of 1865 was not the one that had gone to war. It was something new, untested, an experiment reborn in its own fire. The federal government, once small and hesitant, now stretched its hands across the nation. It built railroads, funded schools, and redefined what it meant to be a citizen. The war had taught Washington that power could be national, and in peace, it chose to keep it that way. Taxes, currency, banking, systems once scattered among states, were drawn into one center, like iron filings to a magnet. The blood of the Union had bound not just men to a cause, but laws to a nation. In the years before the war, America's money was chaos. Every state, every town, every bank printed its own paper, each note worth only as much as its maker's reputation. But war does not tolerate confusion. To feed armies, to move supplies, to pay soldiers, the Union had been forced to create uniformity. So came the National Banking Acts, turning private chaos into public order. Greenbacks. The first truly national currency began to circulate, their color the same shade as the uniforms of the men who fought for them. The economy became one heartbeat, regulated, standardized, unified. And though the soldiers could not see it then, this invisible victory would outlast every battle. For with money came the power to build, to create industries, bridges, and cities. It was the first time in history that a nation realized war could not only destroy economies, it could also design them. The same war that split the railways would soon make them the arteries of America. The railroad had been the war's most powerful weapon, carrying food, troops, and steel faster than the wind. Now, in peace, it became the nation's spine. From the ashes of conflict rose the dream of a transcontinental world. Steel tracks binding oceans, engines whispering progress through the wilderness. Men who had commanded regiments now commanded corporations. The generals of the battlefield became the architects of industry. Pittsburgh's furnaces glowed where cannons once roared. Iron, once used for destruction, was reborn as the skeleton of cities. Factories replaced fortresses. Assembly lines replaced marching lines. The war had taught America how to mobilize, and it would never forget. It is easy to think of the Civil War as an ending, but in truth, it was a beginning. The United States had not only survived, it had learned how to operate like an empire. The scale of its logistics, the reach of its industry, the central command of its government, these were blueprints the world would one day imitate. From Berlin to Tokyo, from Moscow to London, observers took notes. They watched a democracy wield the tools of empire and emerge stronger for it. The idea that a nation could be rebuilt from within, that ruin could be fertile ground for reinvention, spread like a quiet contagion across continents. Other countries would soon study America's transformation as they faced their own shattered futures. Reconstruction became more than policy. It became philosophy. But not all rebuilding is visible. For many, the war's aftermath was an internal one, a reconstruction of the soul. Freed men and women, their chains broken by law but not yet by circumstance, walked roads that had once carried soldiers. They built homes where fields had burned. They opened schools, churches, and businesses. In their courage, the promise of freedom found form. It was not easy. For every hand that offered help, another reached out to pull them back. But progress, like steel, is forged through resistance. And from those first sparks of struggle came the fires that would light generations to come: civil rights, suffrage, equality. All of them traces of that first blueprint, that a nation can rebuild itself not just in body, but in conscience. The cities too began to change. Before the war, they had been crowded clusters of commerces, their streets muddy, their skylines low. Now, brick by brick, they began to rise. The veterans who once dug trenches now laid foundations. Architects who had studied the geometry of fortifications turned their minds to skyscrapers. The rhythm of hammers replaced the rhythm of drums. America began to dream vertically. Factories stretched skyward. Iron bridges arched like prayers over rivers. The smoke that once meant war now meant progress. The same ambition that had driven armies now drove engineers, and beneath their ambition ran a new faith that the human hand could shape the future. In the White House, the echoes of Lincoln still lingered. The men who followed him, whether in vision or in doubt, walked in the architecture of his unfinished dream. His death had made him myth, but his policies had made him blueprint. Homestead Acts to populate the West. Morrill Acts to build universities. Pacific Railway Acts to unite coasts. Each one a brick in a new America, a republic that believed knowledge, land, and labor could be engines of progress. The war had broken the past, but in doing so, it had cleared the way for imagination. And imagination, once awakened, does not sleep. Even in the ruins of the South, change began to stir. Plantations were rebuilt not by enslaved hands, but by free labor, slowly, painfully, transforming fields of bondage into economies of trade. Rail lines were extended, towns reborn, markets reopened. For some, it was survival. For others, redemption. And though prejudice and poverty still chained millions, the idea of progress had escaped the plantation walls. It moved in whispers through the cotton fields, in sermons beneath broken steeples, in the letters of freedmen learning their own names. Reconstruction was never only political, it was personal. Every plow, every schoolhouse, every hand that learned to write was part of the same design, the rebuilding of identity. But while hearts healed slowly, industries raced ahead. Steel became the new soil. The clatter of machines replaced the rustle of crops. Cities grew restless, alive with sparks and ambition. Inventors who had built weapons during the war now turned their genius toward peace. Rail cars became passenger trains. Telegraphs became news networks. Factories began producing more than war demanded. They began producing dreams. America was learning how to mass-produce the future. And the blueprint spread. The world watched as this once fractured republic became a living experiment in reconstruction. Nations in Europe saw that progress could be planned, that central banking could stabilize chaos, that infrastructure could unify culture. The old world learned from the new, just as the new had once learned from the old. The cycle of imitation had reversed. In the quiet of classrooms, teachers spoke of unity instead of division. In factories, laborers learned that their sweat built not just products, but permanence. In offices and banks, clerks handled notes and ledgers that stretched across a continent. This was no longer a nation of isolated towns. It was a network, a living, breathing organism of commerce, labor, and law. And within that web, The idea of America began to change. It was not merely a democracy anymore. It was a machine for progress, self-correcting, self-improving, driven by both memory and ambition. The blueprint was no longer drawn on parchment. It was drawn in steel, and in the hearts of those who believed that tomorrow could be engineered. But progress always asks a price. For every bridge that rose, a battlefield's ghost still lingered. For every invention born, a memory of what was lost persisted. The veterans who built railroads remembered the rails that carried them to war. The blacksmith who forged factory steel remembered the iron he once shaped into cannon. Reconstruction was never clean. It was not rebirth, but metamorphosis, a slow shedding of skin, a painful transformation from survival to aspiration. And yet, out of that struggle, a strange peace emerged, the peace of purpose. In the decades that followed, America became the template for a new kind of nation, one that could fall, fracture, and still rebuild. Its model of reconstruction, its faith in systems and infrastructure, its belief that the state could heal the wounds of war, would inspire nations across the globe. Japan, after its own transformation, would look to America's blueprint. Germany, rebuilding after its wars, would study its methods. Even distant colonies and republics, seeking paths from chaos to order, would trace their hopes back to these same principles: industry, unity, progress. The Civil War, once seen as an American tragedy, had become a world lesson. The soldiers who had marched through mud could not have known what they were creating. They thought they were saving a union. They were building a future. Each campfire, each telegraph, each payroll ledger and railway line was part of a larger design, a nation teaching itself how to function, how to think collectively, how to survive not just a war, but the world beyond it. The battlefield had become blueprint. The chaos had become order. The ashes had become foundation. In the final light of sunset over the reconstructed land, the old America rural, divided, uncertain, seemed to fade into memory. In its place rose cities of light and industry, grids of power and connection, a dream made tangible through steel and will. And though the ghosts of war still whispered, their voices were softer now, woven into the hum of progress. The soldiers returned home. They built families, towns, factories. They planted railroads instead of crops. They raised bridges instead of banners. And through them, the nation that had torn itself apart learned how to put itself back together, stronger, faster, for better or worse, forever changed. The Civil War had been a crucible, but from its fire, America emerged with a new identity, one that believed destruction could be redesigned into destiny. From battlefield to blueprint, from cannon smoke to factory steam, from chaos to construction, a nation had reinvented itself. The United States no longer dreamed in soil. It dreamed in steel, and the world watching would never be the same again. Across the ocean, the smoke of America's war drifted like a distant storm. Its thunder was faint, but the world listened. From palaces and parliaments, from barracks and cafes, men and women looked westward to the land where democracy had nearly destroyed itself, and then impossibly survived. They watched the flames of the Civil War not just as tragedy, but as revelation. It was not simply a fight between North and South. It was a question asked of every nation on earth. Could freedom endure without a king? Could a republic torn by contradictions still be reborn by conviction? In Prussia, generals bent over maps, tracing the movements of Grant and Sherman. They studied the rail lines, the logistics, the speed of mobilization. For them, the American conflict was not distant chaos. It was instruction. The art of war was changing, and America had written the first chapter of the new manual. Prussia would read it well. Within a decade, its armies would march through Europe, united under a single iron will. And in their strategies, in their railways, their telegraphs, their relentless coordination, echoed the blueprints first tested across the American fields of death. Bismarck watched too. He saw in Lincoln's struggle a reflection of his own ambition. to forge unity out of division, to weld provinces into a nation. He learned that nationalism could be born not just from victory, but from shared suffering. That a people tested by fire could emerge not fractured, but fused. And so across the Rhine and the Elbe, the lessons of the Union's endurance became the foundations of a German empire. The world had watched America break, and realized that from the shards, something stronger could be built. In Britain, the reaction was more complicated. The empire that ruled the seas found itself staring into a moral mirror. For many in London, the war was business. Cotton from the south filled their mills. Trade with the Confederacy meant profit. But conscience was not silent. In smoky taverns and crowded meeting halls, the working class of Britain cheered for Lincoln. They saw in the Union's cause a reflection of their own longing, that labor might one day stand equal to power, that men might not be chained by birth or circumstance. When the Emancipation Proclamation reached English shores, it was read aloud in churches and printed in penny papers. To the poor of Manchester and Birmingham, it was more than foreign news. It was hope. Queen Victoria's ministers debated intervention, tempted to recognize the Confederacy for the sake of commerce. But the voice of the people, the moral tide rising from the streets, held them back. For once, conscience outshouted coin. And so Britain stayed its hand, a decision that would change the course of empires. Because the world had seen something unprecedented, a democratic government led not by nobles but by citizens, fighting not for conquest, but for principle. The monarchy of Britain, ancient and proud, took note. If democracy could endure such blood and yet live, perhaps it was not so fragile after all. Reformers in Parliament began to whisper, the age of kings was waning. The future would belong to people, not crowns. In Paris, the salons filled with argument. Napoleon III, ever the opportunist, weighed how the conflict might serve his designs. France had long danced between revolution and empire, its heart divided between liberty and order. The American war was a mirror of its own paradox. Writers, poets, and philosophers dissected the meaning of Lincoln's struggle. Victor Hugo, exiled and prophetic, called the abolition of slavery the dawn of universal justice. To him, America was not just a nation, it was humanity's experiment. And when the news of Lincoln's assassination reached Europe, bells tolled as though a monarch had fallen. Crowds in London, Paris, and Rome gathered in mourning. They saw in his death not the fall of a leader, but the martyrdom of an idea, that compassion could govern, that power could serve principle. Across the continent, the Republican dream flickered again. In Italy, newly unified under Garibaldi's banner, the story of America was proof that unification need not be tyranny. In Poland, under foreign yoke, freedom's exiles whispered Lincoln's name like a prayer. And in the hearts of reformers everywhere, the Civil War became myth, a saga of rebirth through righteousness. Farther east, the ripples reached the shores of Japan. The shogun's world of samurai and silence was crumbling beneath the weight of Western intrusion. Steamships haunted their coasts, bearing flags and cannons and foreign ideas. Among the young scholars of the Meiji generation, there was fascination with the American conflict. They saw in it the power of modernization, the fusion of technology, discipline, and national will. They studied the rifles, the telegraphs, the railroads, and saw a future written not in swords, but in steel. When Japan finally opened its doors to the world, it modeled much of its army, its schools, even its constitution, on lessons learned from the American example. They understood that survival in the New World demanded transformation, and the Civil War had shown how a nation could transform itself through pain, through adaptation, through relentless purpose. From that spark would grow an empire of its own, one that would one day test the very world that inspired it. In Russia, too, the echo was felt. Only 2 years before Lincoln's proclamation, Tsar Alexander II had freed the serfs of his empire. It was emancipation on another scale, but the struggle to define freedom, was eerily familiar. The Russian intelligentsia watched America's convulsions with fascination. If the Western Republic could abolish slavery and survive, perhaps autocracy was not the only path to order. But the Tsar's court saw a warning instead. To them, democracy looked like disorder dressed as idealism. They feared not America's collapse, but its endurance. Still, the seed was planted. Decades later, revolutionaries would cite Lincoln and the Union as proof that oppression could end, that systems could be remade by conviction alone. The Civil War's echo in Russia would take time to grow, but it would never be silenced. Even the colonial world, still shackled under empire, felt the tremor. In the Caribbean, where sugar fields still bled, enslaved workers whispered of America's victory. In Brazil, the last great slave empire, debates raged in Parliament about the future of bondage. And when abolition finally came there in 1888, it was said that Lincoln's ghost smiled across the equator. The idea of freedom, once contained within borders, had learned to travel. Ships carried not only goods, but ideals. Each port where the story of emancipation arrived became another spark in the slow-burning fire of liberation. The Civil War had begun as an American tragedy, but by the end, it belonged to the world. Every newspaper headline and every translated speech, every photograph of battlefields and freedmen became a fragment of global memory. Technology carried the message farther than ever before. Telegraph cables pulsed with news across oceans. Printing presses spilled ink faster than truth could travel. For the first time in history, humanity watched a war in something close to real time. The image of democracy bleeding, then healing, captured imaginations everywhere. It proved that nations could change course, that ideals could survive catastrophe. The concept of a modern state was reborn. And yet, not all who learned from America learned its mercy. In Europe, generals noted not the moral but the mechanical lessons. They saw total war as efficiency, the coordination of industry, manpower, and will. They would perfect it decades later in their own crucibles, in fields that would make Antietam seem small. The Civil War had shown the world that power could be organized, that entire populations could be mobilized for conflict. It had revealed both the promise and the peril of modernity. And though it gave rise to progress, it also planted the seeds of wars yet to come. Every empire that studied the Union's victory took from it what it wanted. Some took its ideals, others its methods. Few took its conscience. But perhaps the greatest echo was not in governments, nor armies, nor industrialists, but in the hearts of ordinary people. From Dublin to Delhi, from Warsaw to Buenos Aires, men and women who had never seen America spoke of its war as if it were their own. They saw in it a story of hope, that tyranny could fall, that humanity could rise above greed. They quoted Lincoln's words like scripture. They dreamed that one day their lands too might find a Gettysburg of the spirit, a place where sacrifice could sanctify freedom. In the decades that followed, movements for independence and equality would invoke the same symbols. Black flags in Africa, tricolor banners in Europe. Each carried whispers of the old Union flag, a reminder that even the most divided nations can find unity again. And through it all, the ghost of the American war lingered in diplomacy's halls. Ambassadors invoked it when urging reform. Kings cited it as warning. Revolutionaries used it as prophecy. It became not just history, but language, a vocabulary of transformation. The battlefield had turned into metaphor. Every uprising, every civil struggle thereafter was compared to the one across the Atlantic. Every leader seeking legitimacy has invoked the name of Lincoln. His image, tall, solemn, wounded by mercy, crossed oceans on lithographs and speeches. He became more than a man. He became the symbol of conscience itself. By the century's end, the world had changed beyond recognition. Empires had begun to crumble, machines had replaced muscle, and the voice of the people had grown louder than the thrones. But in the quiet chambers of history, you can still hear the faint echo of that distant war. The rumble of artillery fading into the hum of industry, the cries of freedom crossing languages and oceans, the whisper that equality once kindled cannot be contained. The Civil War had been born of division, but its aftermath bound humanity closer. It taught the world that progress carries pain, that reform demands sacrifice, and that freedom, once tasted, demands to be shared. In Prussia's barracks, in Japan's academies, in Britain's mills and France's cafes, its lessons endured. Every plan for modernization, every vision of reform, every constitution drafted in the following century carried traces of its influence. The ripple became tide. And though the faces changed, the rhythm remained the same. A nation reborn, teaching the world how to rise from its own ruin. The Civil War had ended within America's borders, but its meaning escaped them forever. Beyond the battlefields, beyond the graves, beyond even the memory of its soldiers, it became a compass for the modern world, a testament that humanity, when broken, can still rebuild. When the cannons went silent, the silence did not bring peace. It brought echoes hollow, endless, stretching from the ruins of Richmond to the quiet corners of every home that had known loss. The war was over, but the story refused to die. Across the nation, the air itself felt haunted. Fields that once thundered with gunfire now bloomed with wildflowers, and beneath those flowers, men slept, tens of thousands of them, their names fading faster than their bones. The survivors returned to find a landscape rewritten. The same hills, the same rivers, but nothing was the same. Every road was now a memory. Every town had ghosts. And so began a new kind of labor, not to rebuild the body of the nation, but its memory. A war like this demanded remembrance. It demanded monuments, rituals, stories, something that could make sense of the unspeakable. The first memorials were simple. Wooden crosses, rough stones, names carved by trembling hands. Mothers and widows walked the fields, searching for the places where their loved ones had fallen. Sometimes they guessed, sometimes they prayed. Each grave was a conversation with silence. But as the years passed, the nation began to build its grief into something lasting. Cemeteries bloomed across the land, rows upon rows of white markers, stretching toward the horizon like a second army. The fallen had found formation once more, this time in marble instead of flesh. At Arlington, a plantation turned into a cemetery. The dead took root where slavery once stood. It was as if the ground itself had demanded justice, as if the soil knew that the story must end here, where bondage became sacrifice and sacrifice became memory. The marble gleamed under the sun, each stone identical, each name equally honored. Here, rank dissolved. In death there were no generals or privates, only citizens who had carried the burden of belief. And yet, behind every stone, there was a story that refused to be the same. Some were carved with certainty, others marked only as unknown. The unknown dead became a nation unto themselves, a silent republic of those who gave everything and left behind nothing but a mystery. Artists began to fill the silence. Pain became pageantry, grief became architecture. Where words failed, marble spoke. Where silence felt unbearable, statues rose. In town squares and capitol lawns, the war was reborn in bronze and stone. A soldier at rest, a flag unfurled, a mother waiting by an empty chair. Each monument was an attempt to say, this mattered. And so a new kind of battle began, a battle for how to remember. For the North, the monuments spoke of union and liberty, a war to preserve the dream of equality. For the South, the statues whispered of honor, of lost cause and noble defeat. In marble, both sides sought immortality. And in that search, history began to blur. Memory became selective. Some wounds were polished smooth, others buried beneath flowers and flags. A war that had been fought over slavery was, in stone, rewritten into tragedy alone. The past was being sculpted, one chisel stroke at a time. But memory did not live only in monuments. It lived in the hands of artists, in the verses of poets, in the gaze of the new machine that would change memory forever. The camera. Before the Civil War, death had always been distant. A rumor, a report, an image imagined. But the lens changed everything. For the first time in history, humanity could see war. Photographers followed the armies like shadows. Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, names now whispered through the fog of history. They dragged their heavy glass plates across mud and blood, capturing moments the world had never dared to face. At Antietam, they found bodies piled like driftwood. At Gettysburg, the dead still wore the expressions of surprise. The images were raw, unposed, stripped of glory. When they reached the cities, people stared in stunned silence. They had expected portraits of victory. What they saw instead was truth, and truth was unbearable. Shop windows displayed the photos as exhibitions. Crowds gathered, unable to look away. It was said that those who saw them would never see the world the same again. The camera had done what words could not. It made history visible. It made grief undeniable. And it made memory permanent. The poets followed close behind. They gave the silence rhythm, the sorrow meaning. Walt Whitman, who had walked among the wounded in Washington's hospitals, wrote of faces he could not forget, boys who smiled through fever, men who whispered home before dying. His words carried the heartbeat of the Republic itself, slowed by pain, yet steady with love. He called the dead beautiful uncut hair of graves, turning rot into poetry, loss into prayer. Emily Dickinson, watching from her quiet room in Amherst, turned the distant thunder into introspection. She wrote not of armies, but of absence, the echo that remains when the cannon fades. Her poems were the whispers between the pages of history, the small griefs that never made it to the monuments. And then came the painters, the composers, the sculptors, each trying to catch the flicker of something too large to name. They built a language of mourning that the world would borrow for generations to come. The Civil War had invented the modern way to remember. It had turned sorrow into art. But even as beauty bloomed from pain, the question lingered. What do we choose to remember, and what do we choose to forget? In the North, parades marched to the rhythm of victory. Bands played Battle Hymn of the Republic as veterans lifted flags worn thin by time. In the South, the same grief took different shape. Women dressed in mourning gathered to tend to Confederate graves, planting flowers, reciting prayers. It was through their hands that a myth was born, a story of gallantry and devotion that softened defeat into legend. Memorial Days began, first as local ceremonies, then as national ritual. The act of remembering became itself an act of healing, and sometimes of forgetting. Because in choosing how to honor, the nation also chose what to silence. The enslaved who had dug trenches and cooked for armies, the black soldiers who had fought for freedom, the widows who lived the rest of their lives in poverty, their stories faded beneath the marble arches. But the stones could not erase the truth. Time, patient and relentless, would one day make those buried voices rise again. Around the world, others watched this new architecture of mourning unfold. Europe had known war for centuries, but never had it seen remembrance made so personal. American cemeteries were not built to glorify generals, they were built to humanize loss. Each grave had a name. Each name was a life. In Britain and France, artists took note. When their own wars came, wars of empire, wars of industry, they would borrow from America's template. White stones, order, equality in death. It was a quiet revolution in how humanity faced its own reflection. The Civil War had taught the world that grief could be organized, that sorrow could have structure. It had shown that mourning too could be democratic. Years turned into decades. The marble aged, the iron fences rusted, and the children of those who had fought grew old. But the memory did not fade. It evolved. In classrooms, teachers spoke of honor and sacrifice. In films, the war was replayed in black and white. In museums, relics of the conflict, a belt buckle, a letter, a faded uniform, became relics of faith. And every time the camera turned its gaze back on those fields, the ghosts seemed to stir again. The lens that had once exposed the horror now softened it, romanticized it, turned it into story. That too was memory's power, to heal, but also to hide. Still, in the quiet places, in the hush of Arlington at dawn, in the solitary flower laid on a nameless grave, the truest memory endured. Not the kind carved into stone, but the kind carried in the heart. Because marble can crack and photographs can fade, but the memory of love, of loss, of human courage remains immune to time. The war had remade the landscape of the nation, not just with railroads and laws, but with grief made visible. It had taught America how to mourn, and in doing so, it taught the world. Today, when we walk among those rows of white markers, we are not merely visiting history. We are standing inside it. Each stone is a sentence in an unfinished story, each name a reminder that the cost of ideals is always written in blood. The monuments, the photographs, the poems, they are all attempts to hold time still, to say, we remember. We have not forgotten. You mattered. But memory, like marble, is never pure. It carries the fingerprints of those who shaped it, the sculptor's choice, the historian's frame, the nation's need to believe that suffering can be sanctified. And yet beneath all that, beneath the interpretations and the myths, the truth still hums quietly. The simple, aching truth that ordinary people gave everything for something larger than themselves. That is what the marble holds. Not perfection, but permanence. In the end, memory itself became the final monument, built not of stone, but of story, passed from voice to voice, from century to century. And if you listen closely, in the wind that moves through the cemeteries, you can still hear them, the murmurs of those who lived and died for an unfinished dream. The sound of a nation remembering itself, the echo of grief turned into grace. The war ended long ago, but the memory, the marble, the poetry, the photograph, the quiet heartbeat of remembrance still endures, because what began in violence found its eternity in silence. And in that silence, humanity learned the art of never forgetting. The guns have fallen silent. The flags hang limp in the morning haze, and for the first time in 4 years, the nation breathes, though it feels less like peace and more like exhaustion. The Union has held, but the cost is beyond counting. More than 600,000 lives, entire towns turned to ash, families divided by faith, by blood, by silence. The Republic survived its trial by fire, but survival is not the same as healing. Now comes the harder work, reconstruction, a word heavy with promise and betrayal. The war was fought to end slavery, but ending slavery was only the beginning. Freedom once declared must be defined, defended, and lived. And for millions newly freed from bondage, the dawn of liberty feels uncertain, as though the morning light could still be stolen back by night. They stand at the threshold of a new world, barefoot, proud, unprepared, their names no longer written in ledgers, but in history. The chains are gone, but the scars remain. And beyond those scars lies a question that will shape the soul of the nation. What does it mean to be free? In the cities, old banners of victory flutter, but their colors seem faded. The soldiers returning home find a country they no longer recognize. The towns they left behind have changed or vanished. The ideals they fought for feel distant, buried under rubble and grief. And yet, amidst the ruins, there is movement. Slow, fragile, hopeful. Railways rebuild. Bridges rise again. The hum of industry returns, and with it the rhythm of survival. But there is another rebuilding underway, one that cannot be done with hammer and nail. It is the rebuilding of faith in democracy, in unity, in justice itself. The Constitution bends and stretches, learning to include all men, and one day, all voices. The old parchment breathes anew, rewritten not with ink, but with blood and conviction. In Washington, laws are drafted, debated, resisted. The 14th Amendment, citizenship to all born on American soil. The 15th, the right to vote, no matter the color of your skin. For the first time, the idea of America begins to match its own promise. But ideas, like seeds, must find soil to survive, and not all soil welcomes them. In the South, freedom meets fury. Plantations lie empty. Pride lies wounded. The old order crumbles, and those who once ruled by the whip now dream of restoring their power by law and terror. Night riders emerge, hooded figures moving through the dark, carrying torches, carrying hate. They burn what they cannot control. They fear what they cannot undo. And yet, in the face of their cruelty, something astonishing happens. The rise of courage. Men and women who had once been considered property now stand in courthouses, in schools, in Congress. They build churches and open businesses, create towns that breathe freedom into the soil itself. Names like Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, black senators in a nation still learning to say the word equal. Frederick Douglass, his voice rising over the broken landscape, reminding the world that progress is not a gift, it is a demand. But reconstruction is a fragile dream, and dreams in a weary nation can be difficult to protect. The North, tired of sacrifice, begins to turn away. Factories call men back to work. Railroads expand westward, promising new frontiers, new distractions, and in the shadows of that fatigue, old powers return. By ballots and bayonets, the South reclaims its rule, piece by piece. What had been promised, 40 acres, a mule, a share in the dream, turns to dust. The Freedmen's Bureau, once a beacon of hope, crumbles under politics and prejudice. Schools are burned, rights are stripped. A new kind of bondage begins, poverty, debt, and silence. The nation, unwilling to face the cost of true equality, chooses instead the comfort of forgetting. Reunion, it decides, is more important than justice. And so the statues rise. The songs of the lost cause drift through the air like incense. The story of the war is rewritten, not as liberation, but as tragedy shared equally by both sides. The victors seek reconciliation, the defeated seek redemption, and in that uneasy compromise, the truth is softened, the pain polished, the past reshaped. Still, beneath the marble and the myths, the Republic breathes, wounded, yes, but alive. For every injustice reborn, there is also resistance. Communities of freedmen gather to vote, to learn, to teach, to write their names into the record. They open schools in church basements. They teach children to read the very documents once used to exclude them. In those dimly lit rooms, America is being rewritten again, this time not by lawmakers but by dreamers. The letters of the alphabet become weapons of hope. The Bible, once read to justify bondage, now preaches liberation. Every page turned is an act of defiance. Every word spoken is a declaration of belonging. The Republic is learning to speak again, and its voice is more diverse than ever before. In small towns across the South, Union soldiers stay behind, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. They protect freedmen at the polls, stand guard over schools, record testimonies for history's memory. But even their presence cannot last forever. Politics shifts. Elections change. The federal gaze turns elsewhere, and one by one, the blue uniforms fade from the streets. When they are gone, the night returns, slowly, steadily, like a tide reclaiming the shore. By the end of the century, many of the freedoms born in Reconstruction have withered beneath new laws and new lies. But the radical idea that all men are equal before the law, remains buried deep, waiting for its next resurrection. The world is watching. Across the oceans, empires take note. They see that a republic, a nation without a king, without nobility, without a crown, has nearly destroyed itself, and yet still stands. The Civil War had shown them that democracy was fragile. Reconstruction now shows them that it is also resilient. In the palaces of Europe, ministers whisper of America's experiment, how a government of the people can rebuild itself from ashes, how a constitution can bend, but not break. In Russia, serfs are freed by decree, and the Tsar's advisors study Lincoln's words. In Italy, Garibaldi dreams of unity through struggle. In Japan, the Meiji reformers watch, learning how modern nations are forged not by conquest, but by conviction. Even in the colonies of distant empires, voices rise. If America can redefine freedom, why not us? The ripples of Reconstruction travel farther than the war itself. They reach across oceans, across centuries, into the hearts of those who have never seen America, but feel its contradictions beating like their own. And yet, within America, the struggle continues. The wounds of war are not only physical, they are written into laws, into hearts, into silence. Reconstruction ends officially in 1877. But the work of rebirth, the slow, painful learning of justice, never does. Generations will carry it forward, through marches, through courts, through voices that will not stay quiet. The dream of the Republic, that all men are created equal, remains unfinished, but unfinished dreams are the ones that endure. In the decades that follow, the country races toward the future. Cities rise, machines multiply. The railroads stretch like veins across the continent. The wounds of war become the foundations of modern America. But beneath the noise of progress, the quiet heartbeat of Reconstruction still echoes. It whispers through every movement for equality, every demand for dignity. The freedman's prayer becomes the worker's demand. The union's victory becomes the immigrant's hope. The idea of a nation reborn becomes the story of a world learning to live without kings. Democracy, once dismissed as fragile, begins to seem inevitable, not because it is perfect, but because it refuses to die. Sometimes rebirth is not a blaze of glory. Sometimes it is a slow, steady fire, burning beneath the surface, quietly reshaping everything it touches. That was the legacy of Reconstruction. Not triumph, but persistence. Not perfection, but progress. A promise written in scars and renewed with every generation that dared to believe again. If you walk today through the halls of Congress, through the marble chambers of Washington, you can still feel it. The pulse of that era, the fragile heartbeat of a nation that refused to end. For every amendment, every law, every right defended, there is the echo of that time when the Republic was broken and built again. From the ashes of division came a greater understanding that democracy is not given, it is built and rebuilt again. That freedom is not a destination, it is a practice. That equality is not a word, it is a responsibility. The Republic that rose from the ruins of civil war was not the same one that had fallen. It was scarred, wiser, more complex, more human. It had learned that power can destroy, but it can also create. That justice may falter, but it can also rise again. That even after the darkest night, a people can choose morning. And perhaps that was the truest victory of all. Not the triumph of armies, but the endurance of ideals. Not the rebuilding of cities, but the rebirth of conscience. The Republic had been tested, and though it cracked, it did not collapse. It bent toward freedom, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. And as the world looked on, it saw not a perfect nation, but a living one. A reminder that progress is not a single act, but an unending motion. That history, like democracy itself, is not something we inherit. It is something we must keep creating. So the war ended, but the rebirth began. The soldiers went home, but the struggle continued. And from the ruins of both victory and loss, a truth emerged, that nations, like people, are not defined by how they fall, but by how they rise again. The Republic was reborn, not in glory, not in perfection, but in persistence. And the world, watching from afar, learned that even from the deepest wound, a heartbeat can return. A new rhythm, a new beginning, a fragile, beautiful proof that freedom, once awakened, cannot be silenced. Because once a nation learns to rise from its own ashes, it never truly falls again. The guns are silent now, but silence does not mean peace. It means memory. It means the earth still listening to footsteps long gone, to hearts that once beat in rhythm with the cannon's thunder. The fields where men fell are quiet beneath morning fog, but if you close your eyes, the echoes remain. A horse snorts in the distance. A drumbeat fades beneath the soil. The faint whisper of a bugle drifts through the trees, not in sound, but in spirit. The war is over, but its shadow still walks with us. Every generation since has found its reflection in that great divide. Every march for justice, every stand against tyranny, every voice raised for the forgotten, all carry within them a faint echo of 1865. Because that war was never just about maps or governments. It was about who we are when the world splits apart and whether we can find our way back. The United States that rose from the ruins of war was not the same one that went in. It had been remade, scar by scar. The dream of democracy, once fragile as parchment, had been baptized in blood and reborn in steel. It had shown the world something terrifying and yet beautiful, that an idea could survive even when a nation nearly did not. And that idea that freedom is not a gift, but a struggle, would travel far beyond American shores. Across the Atlantic, in the drawing rooms of Europe, the Civil War became a parable. Kings whispered of it in private, afraid of what it meant. Commoners spoke of it in hope, daring to believe that the age of empires might one day end. In Paris, the revolutionaries of the future would read Lincoln's words like scripture. In London, abolitionists would hold his portrait beside their own banners for justice. In distant lands, people saw in America's agony a mirror of their own. Because what happened between the blue and the gray was never truly just an American story. It was human. It was universal. It was the tale of how a society can collapse into itself and then crawl, bloodied but breathing, toward a higher truth. The Union soldiers who marched home returned to a country scarred in soul. The Confederates who limped back to their ruined towns carried ghosts in their eyes. Freed men and women stepping for the first time into the uncertain light of liberty carried dreams too large to fit in the world they were given. They all had to learn what freedom really meant and how heavy it could be. History often ends its stories at the treaty, the surrender, the final gunfire. But the real war, the one that outlives bullets, begins afterward. It's fought in classrooms, in courtrooms, in the quiet corners of memory. It's fought every time someone chooses justice over comfort, truth over silence. Beyond the battlefields, the Civil War became a living thing, a story whispered through generations, reshaped by artists, politicians, and dreamers. It became the backdrop of poetry, the soul of music, the heartbeat of every movement that demanded something better. It became the moral compass by which nations measured themselves. From Selma's dusty roads to Berlin's crumbling walls, its echo was heard again. From Soweto's uprising to Kiev's frozen squares, its ghost passed silently among the crowds. Each time humanity faced itself, each time the world divided between those who ruled and those who suffered, the spirit of that old war stirred. Because that war was not only fought to preserve a union, it was fought to define what kind of union was worth preserving, and that question still hangs in the air today. When nations tear apart over identity, when neighbors see enemies in one another's eyes, when fear dresses itself as patriotism, that old lesson returns. That we can destroy ourselves in the name of our own beliefs. That progress is fragile. That freedom, once won, must be protected not just by armies, but by conscience. The battlefields of Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, they are now grass and stone, but they are also mirrors. Look long enough into them, and you will see every struggle since reflected back, civil wars of words, revolutions of thought, battles fought in the hearts of men and women who refused to let history repeat itself. The Civil War gave us more than a new America. It gave us a vocabulary for struggle and a vision of redemption. It gave the world a warning that liberty unguarded can rot from within, and a promise that even the darkest age can give birth to light. In the quiet aftermath of war, as the last veterans faded into memory, the nation built monuments. Granite, bronze, marble symbols of valor, of sorrow, of reconciliation. But the truest monument was not carved in stone. It was written in the conscience of humanity. It was the idea that ordinary people, farmers, laborers, freed slaves, immigrants, could shape the destiny of a continent. That the world could be remade not by kings or conquerors, but by conviction. And though the rifles have long rusted and the flags hang tattered in museums, that conviction endures. It whispers through every protest song, every ballot cast, every dream that refuses to die. Because the Civil War was never just America's. It belongs to everyone who has ever fought to be free. Imagine the sound of the night wind sweeping across the old fields of Virginia. Imagine the moonlight glinting off the stones of Arlington, the faint rustle of the trees at Gettysburg. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them, not the cries of war, but the breathing of the earth itself, remembering. It remembers the young man from Georgia who never saw his home again. It remembers the enslaved woman in South Carolina who sang freedom's hymn before anyone else dared to. It remembers the nurse who refused to rest, the teacher who started a school in the ruins, the poet who wrote until his heart broke. It remembers Lincoln, walking through the silent streets of Washington, knowing that his dream would outlive him. It remembers us, all of us, because we are still living the story they began. When a nation argues about justice, it is still echoing that same debate. When people march for equality, they still carry that same banner. When the world looks toward America in admiration or in doubt, it still measures the distance between what was promised and what remains undone. Beyond the battlefields lies that unending war, not fought with guns but with ideals, not written in blood, but in the choices of each generation. The war for the human spirit to rise, to forgive, to understand, never ends. It only changes shape. From the plantations of the South to the streets of Birmingham, from the cotton fields to the factories, from the whispers of freedom to the roar of movements that refuse to fade. It lives on in the courage to speak when silence is easier, in the strength to love a country even while demanding it be better, in the quiet dignity of those who build bridges where others would build walls. Perhaps that is the Civil War's truest victory, not the end of slavery, not the preservation of the Union, but the awakening of a conscience that could no longer look away. Because once a nation has looked into the mirror of its own cruelty, it cannot unsee it. It can only decide whether to change. The soldiers who fell did not all die for the same cause. But in their dying, they left behind something larger than any banner or belief. They left behind a question. Can we learn from our own destruction? The world still asks that question. And every act of courage, every moment of compassion, every stand for truth is an answer whispered back across time. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of that. The world quiet again, the stars unblinking. The wind moving gently through the fields that once ran red. Think of all who came before, and all who still carry their echoes. The guns are silent, but their echo crosses centuries. Every struggle for equality, every march for rights carries a fragment of that old, thunderous promise that a people divided can still find unity through sacrifice. From Selma to Soweto, from Berlin to Kiev, the Civil War's ghost walks quietly beside all who fight for freedom. Because beyond the battlefields, beyond the smoke and the sorrow, beyond the lines drawn in blood, the real war, the war for the human spirit, never ends. It only waits in silence for the next generation to pick up the flag of mercy and march forward again.